Okay, let's do a deep dive. Have you ever found yourself just thinking, maybe on your commute or something, and wondering, wait, am I actually the same person I was, say, 10 years ago?
Hmm.
Or, that old puzzle about the ship, where they replace every single part over time. Is it even the same ship anymore?
Yeah, those questions seem simple, but they really open up these huge philosophical rabbit holes, don't they?
They really do. And that's exactly where we're headed today. We've got some fascinating source material here, a YouTube transcript digging into paradoxes, a study guide on key philosophical concepts. Our job is basically to guide you through it.
We're going to pull out the important bits, challenge some of those assumptions maybe you didn't even know you had, and just see what happens when we look closely at how we understand identity, reality, ethics, the big stuff.
Think of it as getting you genuinely well informed, but like in an interesting way. Lots of thought experiments.
Okay, so let's jump in. Identity. Who are you? I mean, how do we even talk about being the same person when everything about us is constantly changing? Cells, memories, thoughts.
Right. And that's where the ship of Theseus and just personal change. How much can you change before you're, well, not you anymore? It's kind of unsettling.
It definitely challenges that gut feeling of continuity.
Mm.
And it links pretty neatly to another paradox the sources bring up, the Sorites paradox, the paradox of the heap.
Ah, the heap of sand one.
Yeah. One grain of sand isn't a heap. Add another, still not a heap. Keep adding one grain. Eventually, you definitely have a heap.
But when? Which grain made the difference? There isn't one.
Exactly. It's like asking when someone becomes bald. How many hairs do you lose? Or rich, what's the exact dollar amount? Our language just doesn't have sharp lines for these things.
So the point is that our concepts are fuzzy.
Pretty much. The source highlights how our everyday language struggles with gradual change. Strict definitions don't always work. They mention things like fuzzy logic as a response, or just accepting that language isn't always precise. The takeaway is our categories are often blurrier than we think.
So our sense of self, the words we use, may be less solid than we assume, which leads naturally from what is to what should be ethics.
Right. How should we act? And maybe the most famous ethical thought experiment is the trolley problem.
Oh, yeah. The runaway trolley. 5 people
Yeah.
on one track, one person on another. You're by the lever, pull it, you save the 5, but kill the 1. Do nothing, the 5 die. What do you do?
It sets up that tension perfectly. Pulling the lever seems, utilitarian. Great is good for the greatest number. Save 5 lives by sacrificing 1.
But you actively cause that one person's death by pulling it. If you do nothing, you didn't directly cause the 5 deaths, you just allowed it. That feels different. More like deontology,
Yeah,
duty-based.
exactly. Don't actively cause harm. And the source brings up that really telling variation. What if you're on a bridge and the only way to stop it is to push a large person off onto the tracks?
Ugh, yeah. The math's the same, 1 life for 5, but pushing someone feels so much worse for most people.
And that's the insight, right? It's not just about the numbers. It reveals how much our moral intuition cares about the type of action, our direct involvement in causing harm. The source connects this to self-driving cars, making split-second choices, medical ethics, military decisions.
Mm.
It's everywhere.
And thinking about rules and duties brings us to Kant's categorical imperative, which the source also covers.
Yeah, Kant gives us this rule-based system. 2 big questions. First, could your action be a universal law? Like, what if everyone did it?
Okay.
Second, are you treating people, yourself included, as ends in themselves, never just as a means to get something else?
So the lying example they use. If I think about lying, what if everyone lied all the time? Trust collapses, language breaks down. So lying is wrong because it can't be universalized. And I'm probably using the person I lie to.
Right. The source points out it emphasizes consistency, duty, reason over just looking at the consequences.
But how do we even get to ethical rules? The source mentions Hume's is-ought problem, Hume's guillotine.
Sounds dramatic, but it's a fundamental point. Hume noticed that people often argue from facts how the world is straight to values, how the world ought to be.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a logical gap.
Like the example in the source, just because people used to live in hierarchies doesn't mean they should.
Exactly. You can't logically derive an ought statement purely from an is statement. You need to introduce a value premise somewhere. How things are doesn't automatically dictate how they should be. Nature isn't inherently right. Tradition isn't inherently right.
Which seems related to moral relativism, another idea the source tackles. The idea that morality isn't fixed or absolute.
Right. The view that what's right or wrong isn't universal, but depends on context, culture, history, maybe even individual perspective. no single objective moral truth.
Contrasting with moral absolutism, where some things are just always wrong, the source mentions different types like cultural relativism versus subjective, individual relativism.
And just reporting what the source says here, it notes the big criticisms like, does this mean we can't condemn horrible acts if a culture accepts them? It potentially leads to nihilism.
But the source also mentions the other side, that it offers a kind of freedom from imposed morals, letting people or groups define their own values. It presents both sides impartially.
Then there's the classic theological challenge, the problem of evil.
If God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, why is there so much suffering and evil?
It's a direct clash between those attributes and the reality we see. The source mentions some standard responses like the free will defense, blaming human choices, or soul-making theodicies where suffering helps us grow.
But it also notes these arguments face real challenges. It's presented as an ongoing, difficult problem for certain worldviews. The core issue is that clash.
And one last ethical idea from the glossary in the source, the problem of dirty hands.
Sounds messy.
It is. It's about leaders, people in power who feel they have to do something morally wrong, lie, maybe even use violence for what they see as a greater good, like national security.
So it challenges rigid rules in real-world situations where all options seem bad.
Exactly. It highlights the tension between strict principles and messy, practical necessities. Ethics is complicated.
It really is. Okay, so if ethics is tricky, what about reality itself? Can we actually be sure about anything? This takes us into skepticism.
Starting with solipsism, the idea that maybe only your mind is real. Everything else could be an illusion.
Whoa, heavy. And Descartes took that kind of doubt seriously, right? Doubting senses, reason, even imagining an evil demon tricking him about everything.
Yeah, the source mentions that demon hypothesis. That's radical skepticism. But in doubting, Descartes found the one thing he couldn't doubt, that he was doubting. A thinking thing must exist to do the doubting.
I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum.
That was his bedrock certainty, as the source presents it. The nugget is that the act of thinking seems to prove the existence of a thinker, even if you doubt everything else. Though what that proves about the external world is another debate.
So, skepticism, broadly, is doubting we can have certain knowledge. The source mentions different kinds.
Yes, like Pyrrho's suggesting we just suspend judgment. Then Descartes' doubt about the external world, the source mentions doubting sense experience, empirical, moral truths, moral skepticism, or religious claims.
But we can't just suspend judgment about everything, can we? We have to live.
Right, and that leads to more moderate skepticism like Hume's. We might not have absolute certainty, but we operate based on probability, experience, habit. The challenge is navigating life without that 100% guarantee.
And even our definition of knowledge gets complicated. The Gettier problem.
Yeah, this attacks the traditional idea that knowledge is justified true belief. So you know something if, 1, you believe it, 2, it's actually true, and 3, you have good reason to believe it.
Seems solid enough.
But Gettier cases show it's not quite enough. The source uses an example like seeing Sarah in her red car. So you believe Sarah owns a red car. You saw her, so you're justified. And let's say it's true, she does own a red car. But the car you saw was her old one that broke down this morning. And she just bought a new, different red car you know nothing about.
Huh. So my belief is true, and I had justification based on what I saw. But did I really know she owned a red car? Feels like luck.
Exactly. It feels like you stumbled into the right answer by coincidence. The insight is that justified true belief isn't always sufficient for genuine knowledge. Something's missing.
Wow. Okay. And another major challenge to our assumptions, especially about the future, is Hume again with the problem of induction.
Right, the scandal of induction. Just because the sun has risen every single day in the past, does that logically prove it will rise tomorrow? Hume says, well, no.
We just assume the future will be like the past.
We do. But our reason for trusting that assumption that induction works seems to be, well, because it worked in the past, which is itself an inductive argument. It's circular.
So all of science, all our predictions, they rest on this assumption we can't strictly prove.
It's a huge challenge. The nugget is realizing how much of our reasoning relies on this principle that's hard to justify non-circularly. The source mentions Popper's idea of falsification. As one response, science tries to disprove theories, not prove them by induction.
Okay, so reality, knowledge, pretty shaky ground sometimes.
Yes.
Which makes you wonder about us, about humans. How do we find meaning? This shifts us towards existence.
And a central debate here is determinism versus free will.
Determinism. Everything's caused by prior events, physics, biology, environment. Your choices aren't really free, they're just the inevitable outcome. Free will is an illusion.
Versus free will, we do have genuine agency. We make choices that aren't predetermined. This feels necessary for things like moral responsibility, right?
Yeah.
Blame, praise. It seems to depend on us having choices.
And the source mentions compatibilism, the attempt to have both.
Yeah, the idea that free will and determinism can coexist. Maybe free will means acting on your own desires and reasons, even if those desires were themselves determined by past events. You're free because you willed it, even if the you is a product of causes.
It's complex. And the source notes neuroscience complicates it further, with studies suggesting brain activity precedes conscious choice sometimes.
Right. But our subjective experience feels incredibly free. So the nugget is this persistent tension. The feeling of freedom versus the arguments for causality and the philosophical attempts to bridge that gap or deny one side.
This weight of freedom, or maybe the lack of inherent meaning, it can lead to what the source calls existential angst.
That deep unease when you confront the idea that maybe life has no built-in purpose, the universe doesn't care, and it's entirely up to you to create meaning and values.
The source mentions Kierkegaard's dizziness of freedom, Sartre's nausea, the feeling of absurdity.
But the key insight, as presented, is that this angst isn't just negative. It can be terrifying, sure, but facing it can also be liberating. It pushes you towards living authentically, defining yourself instead of just following a script.
Taking that no inherent meaning idea even further gets you to nihilism.
The belief that everything, life, values, morality, knowledge, is ultimately meaningless, baseless. Just human constructs, no objective truth behind them.
The source mentions Nietzsche's God is dead, not literally, but meaning the collapse of traditional sources of absolute value.
Which creates a crisis. If nothing's inherently valuable, what do? The source distinguishes passive nihilism, despair, inaction from active nihilism, which sees destroying old values as a chance to create new ones. The nugget is this radical confrontation with meaninglessness and the different responses it provokes again, just relaying the perspectives.
And closely related is the feeling of the absurd.
That clash between our very human desire for meaning and purpose and a universe that just doesn't seem to offer any, it's silent on the matter.
The source brings in Camus and Sisyphus, pushing that boulder forever, pointless from the outside.
But Camus' point, as the source explains it, isn't despair. It's recognizing the absurdity, but rebelling by embracing the struggle itself. Finding meaning in the effort, even if the ultimate goal is never reached. Finding joy in the striving.
Nietzsche has another intense thought experiment about embracing life: eternal recurrence.
Imagine you had to relive your entire life. Every single detail, good and bad, exactly the same, over and over, infinitely.
Wow.
Could you honestly say yes to that?
Yeah.
Would you live your life now in such a way that you'd gladly repeat it forever? The nugget is its power as a test of life affirmation, connecting to a more body, loving your fate, embracing everything.
These are heavy. But switching gears slightly, why do we sometimes know what's right or good for us, but just don't do it? The source talks about akrasia, or weakness of will.
Yeah, that feeling of knowing you should exercise but watching TV instead, or deciding on a diet then eating cake.
The source mentions Socrates thought it was just ignorance. If you really knew cake was bad for you, you wouldn't eat it.
Right, but Aristotle disagreed, and the source notes modern psychology tends to side with Aristotle here. It's more often a failure of self-control. Our desires, emotions, short-term pleasure just override our rational judgment.
So the insight is about that gap between knowing and doing, the limits of willpower. Very relatable.
And another paradox touching on decisions, Buridan's ass.
The donkey between two identical piles of hay.
Exactly. Perfectly rational donkey, identical options, no reason to choose one over the other. The paradox is, does it starve because it can't make a rational choice?
So is pure reason enough? Or do we sometimes need like a random impulse or just will to break ties?
That's the question it raises. The nugget is that pure rationality might sometimes lead to inaction.
And speaking of choice overload, the source mentions the paradox of choice.
The idea that counterintuitively too many choices can make us worse off.
How so?
Well, the source notes it can lead to anxiety, making the decision harder, paralysis by analysis, and even less satisfaction after you choose because you keep wondering about all the options you didn't pick. FOMO, basically.
Yep. Fear of missing out.
Right. It contrasts maximizers, people who have to find the absolute best and are often less happy with satisficers who just pick something good enough and tend to be more content. The takeaway: maybe endless choice isn't always the best thing for us.
Man, so much to think about. Okay, let's shift from existence to the thing doing the existing, the mind. And AI, mind-body problem first.
the big one. Is the mind separate from the body dualism, like Descartes thought? Or are they one thing monism? If monism is it all physical, like materialism says, mind is brain activity, or maybe all mental, like idealism.
The challenge for dualism is, how does a non-physical mind affect a physical body? How do thoughts move your arm?
Exactly.
Right.
Materialism is more common in science now. Mind emerges from the brain. Idealism is rarer. The nugget is a persistent mystery of how subjective experience relates to physical matter.
And within that, there's Chalmers' hard problem of consciousness.
Right. Science can explain the easy problems, how the brain processes info, controls behavior, how neurons fire when you see red.
Okay.
The hard problem is, why does it feel like something to see red? Why is there subjective experience, qualia, consciousness at all?
It seems like explaining the mechanics doesn't explain the feeling itself.
That's the core mystery. The nugget is that gap between physical processes and conscious awareness that materialism still struggles to bridge.
The source also brings up Nozick's experience machine.
Yeah, the thought experiment. Plug into a machine for a lifetime of perfect simulated pleasure. Would you do it?
Probably not.
Nozick thinks most people wouldn't. And his point, the nugget, is that this shows we value more than just feeling good. We value reality, authenticity, actually doing things, being a certain kind of person, even if real life involves struggle.
Makes sense. And then there's Searle's Chinese room argument about AI understanding.
Imagine someone in a room who doesn't know Chinese. They get slips of paper with Chinese writing. They have a big rule book in English telling them which symbols to output in response.
So from outside, it looks like the room understands Chinese. It gives sensible answers.
Right, but the person inside has zero understanding. They're just manipulating symbols based on rules syntax. They don't know the meaning semantics. Searle's argument is that's all computers do.
So simulating understanding isn't the same as actually understanding.
That's his point. The nugget is the challenge it poses to the idea that computation alone can create genuine consciousness or meaning.
Definitely relevant today. Okay, to wrap things up, let's touch briefly on social philosophy, how we live together. The source mentions social contract theory.
The basic idea that society isn't just natural, it's based on an agreement, maybe implicit. We give up some absolute freedom, like in a chaotic state of nature, to get security, order, the benefits of cooperation.
And the source mentions different takes on it.
Yeah, Hobbes saw it as escaping anarchy. Locke focused on protecting natural rights, life, liberty, property, and said we can rebel if the government fails. Rousseau emphasized collective will, participation. The nugget is this core idea of a trade-off. Freedom for security and how that balance gets struck.
And finally, for designing a fair society, Rawls' veil of ignorance.
A brilliant thought experiment. Imagine you're designing society's basic rules, but you do it behind a veil. You don't know who you'll be in that society. Rich, poor, man, woman, talented, disabled, majority, minority. You know nothing about your own position.
So since you could end up anywhere, you design rules that are fair to everyone, especially the worst off, just in case that's you.
That's Rawls' argument. The nugget is that this impartial perspective helps us figure out principles of justice that aren't biased by self-interest. Justice as fairness.
Wow, okay. What a ride through these ideas. From the ship of Theseus and heaps of sand challenging who we are,
To trolley problems testing our morals, to doubting reality with evil demons.
grappling with meaninglessness and the absurd, the mystery of consciousness, how societies form.
And remember, these concepts we've explored, drawn from the sources, they aren't just abstract games. They touch on your everyday life, the choices you make, how you see yourself and others, your place in the world.
So, if our very identity is questionable, if ethics is complex, if reality isn't certain, if meaning is something we have to build, what does that actually mean for how you live starting today?
What will you choose to believe is true or right?
Right.
And how will you act? How will you create meaning now that you've wrestled with these perspectives?